Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to be talking about a simple WebSocket chat room that I built using React, Parcel, and Socket.io, and then also some styling using Bootstrap. This isn't going to be a full-on tutorial where I'm going to code everything from scratch, just because I don't have the time to kind of do that from scratch. Instead, I have the code already written, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through it. So I hope that's a good approach. But basically, this is what we're going to be building, or this is what I've already built. I'm going to explain and talk about. Right now, I have two tabs open. And if someone in tab 1 were to type something and hit enter, notice that that message will show up in the other tab. And this is basically using a node.js server on the back end to kind of facilitate sending messages back using WebSockets. So if I were to load up a new tab, you'll notice that we get a prompt saying, what is your username? I could type in a username or a name. And now we have yet a third user connected. If I go back to those other tabs, you can see that the user Rex showed up. And I can say, hey, what is up from Rex? I can go back to the other and see that that message showed up here. And there's a couple of things that are probably messed up in terms of styling and functionality, such as like if I type in new messages, they go off the screen. I could probably make this a scroll bar and kind of hide the content. I didn't invest too much time into it, so go easy on me if you find bugs, or feel free to do a pull request to fix whatever you want. But the important part is learning how to use WebSockets and Socket.io to kind of send these messages back and forth between your users. And once you've learned that, you can kind of use that knowledge to build more advanced applications to like get notifications on your web application. Like, you know how some apps have like a bell icon that'll light up whenever something new happens, or like an inbox icon, or a game. Like if you played any type of Argo.io game where you have a bunch of people playing a game together, they're probably using some type of WebSockets. So with that being said, let's just go ahead and do a quick code overview of what I did for getting this working. Starting off, I have a chat room folder here, which has basically all of that code. And we have a couple of the dependencies that we're using in this application. Right now, the front end is built using React. We need React DOM to kind of bind React to the DOM. We use Socket.io for the server, and then Socket.io-client for the web browser to be able to connect to our Socket server. I'm using Parcel to kind of bundle everything together. And then NodeMon and Moment are kind of just utility functions. Moment's for using dates and formatting, which you're seeing here basically, this date format. And then NodeMon is basically restarting my server whenever I save a file. And there's a couple of scripts here. If you just run npm start, that's going to run the client and the server, since I have those kind of separated out in different tasks. So that's an overview of the dependencies in the package.json. Now let's talk about the actual code. So if I open up that source folder, you'll notice that basically it splits up into a client and a server related code. The client is composed of client.js, index.html, and style.css. And if you're not familiar with how Parcel works, basically you point it to an HTML file, and it's going to go through that file and bundle up everything that it needs into a single distributed, like dis folder, or dis file, I mean. But I won't kind of go into detail on that. That's probably a different video. But if I open up that index.html, you'll notice here we have a root. We have an element with an ID of root. And then we also import a client.js script on our front end. And that is all the index file looks like. Most of the code is inside of here. So let's go ahead and look at that. And we're also going to be looking at the server. So let's go ahead and look at open client and open server. So inside of client.js, there's a couple of things we're importing. First, we import socket.io-client, and that allows us to connect to a WebSocket. We import Bootstrap and some style sheets so that I can kind of style the UI. I import React DOM, and a couple hooks that I use to keep track of state inside my main app component. And then Moment for kind of formatting the dates. And when this UI first loads, it shows a prompt and asks you what your username is. And after the user enters that, it tries to connect to the socket server, which is running on port 3000. This is kind of something that took me a while to figure out, is you need to specify these transports, or else sometimes your messages will just sit there and wait because, like, for whatever reason, there's a buffer that needs to be filled up before Socket.io will send. So adding these options makes it send off immediately when you do .emit. So that's, I mean, honestly, that's probably like one of the main things that I got caught up on this project. So moving on, if you know much about React, I have a main app function, and that is returning all of my JSX down here. And we're going to kind of go through all this in a second. But at the bottom, we are binding that app component to our root element here that we saw in our index.html. So when this component tries to start, I'm creating 3 different state variables. UseState is a hook method that's provided in React, which allows you to kind of use state inside your functional components. The state we're keeping track of is all of the users, which you saw displayed here. So basically when a user connects or disconnects, we're kind of updating that state and removing that from the array. We have state message, which is used for basically this input box down here. As I type stuff in, that message variable is going to update. And then finally, we have state called messages, which is this array of messages that's coming in as people are typing messages to each other. On top of that, we have a hook called useEffect, which basically is being used for the on component mount. And when this component mounts, we're kind of listening to a bunch of different event types that Socket.io provides us, and then also some custom event types that we're using. So socket.onConnect is basically when you connect to the server. And what we're doing in this particular case is we are emitting our username to the server so that the server can keep track of it. And this is a good stopping point to kind of look at how our server is set up. So let's move over to the server code for a second. Inside of the server code, this is node.js. So we're doing a little context switching now. We have node.js, which we spin up an HTTP server. We then wrap that server using Socket.io here. And again, we provided some options so that the transport is WebSocket. And we have this users map here, which keeps track of all of the users and maps them to the username that they provided. But the cool thing about Socket.io is you can bind to the on connection. So basically, when anyone connects to your socket server, it's going to invoke this callback. And then we're invoking a bunch of different other event listeners when the user types in a message, or when the user disconnects, or when the user submits their username. And then finally, we start the server on port 3000. So that kind of ties it all together. We have the client, which is opening a socket connection to localhost 3000, and the server is hosting a socket server on port 3000. And then that stopping point that we were at, where we emitted that username, that is what we are listening to right here. So when the user, again, fills out something in this prompt here, so for instance, when he says, "What is my name?" and he says Rick or James or something, when he presses enter, we're firing off a WebSocket event called username, and then we're just passing that James string as the payload. And what we're doing here is we create a user with name set to James and ID set to the client.id. Client is a Socket.io object that has a couple of things on it, but ID is kind of useful because it's a unique ID that every client has. So we make that user object, we keep track of it and put it in that user's map, and then we broadcast an event to every user in our chat room to say, hey, we have a user who connected, and then we also emit the user's object to every user in the chat room. So this one here is basically if you wanted to print out something in the messages to say, hey, James connected, you could do that. And this event being emitted is basically saying, here are all the users that are in the server. And that's currently being used to kind of refresh this list of users here in React. So the second part is when I'm typing in something here and I click send, The client is going to be calling the submit function here, and that's going to be emitting a send event with that message state. So in that case, I typed in hello. That's going to be sending a send event. The server is going to be listening to that send event here, going to invoke this callback. And all this does is just broadcast that send event to every other user who is connected to the chat server. So in this case, it kind of ping pongs back a message event with the text, the date stamp, or the date timestamp, and then the user ID who sent it. Actually, this is the username who sent it. And that will come back to the client here. So I said socket on message. And then we just update the state to append that new message to that messages array. So we talked about what happens when you enter into the prompt and hit OK. We talked about what happens when you type into this chat box and click send. One thing we could talk about is when a user disconnects, the server here is going to fire off this callback. And what we do is we just delete that reference from that user's map, and then we broadcast an event saying, hey, this client of ID disconnected, so that everyone's React app is going to call this callback function and basically remove that user from the user's state. So what else can we talk about? We have on users, which again is sent off when someone connects. And that is basically just overriding all the users on the state here so that their names will pop up in this list. On connected, this might actually be a little bit redundant here because when someone connects, we are just sending off that user's values array. So this might be redundant, but we are listening to it, so it's just good to explain it. I think that pretty much covers everything in terms of the socket.io events. We did the connection, when you type into the prompt, when you actually send a message, and when you disconnect. The only thing I didn't really talk about was the JSX stuff, and that's pretty straightforward if you already know React. I mean, we are using Bootstrap to build up a container. We have 2 rows. The first row is displaying the username that you typed into the prompt, and the second row is just 2 columns. The left one has the messages, and the right one has the users. And we basically just map over all the messages and render them one by one with more Bootstrap grid-like structure. And then we have a form that when you submit or click the button, basically it is just going to send off that socket.io event. And then finally we have that users column, which maps over all the users and just displays them in a unordered list. All right, so that pretty much wraps up this little video where I talk about this WebSocket chat server. Hopefully this was useful. I know a lot of people enjoy watching like live coding from scratch, but I originally was doing that, but the video ended up taking so long because I tried to explain every little thing in minute detail. And I decided to just say, screw it, I'm just going to show them the code and talk about the code, and it's up to them to kind of grab it and play with it themselves. And I wish them luck. So good luck to you all if you grab this code and play around with it. Feel free to do a pull request on the Git repo. I will show you where that code is located. If you go to my Git repo here, so github.com/codyseibert/YouTube, there is a folder called chat room. And this is all the code that I am demonstrating in this video right here. So again, if you find a bug, you can do a pull request, or if you have comments or questions, feel free to leave them in this YouTube video. Be sure to subscribe and like if this was a helpful video. Thanks for watching.